Havara Agreement, a controversial pact signed in August 1933 between Nazi Germany and Zionist organizations. This agreement allowed German Jews to transfer a portion of their assets to Palestine by purchasing German goods, which were then shipped to Palestine, enabling immigrants to establish themselves economically. Approximately 60,000 German Jews emigrated to Palestine under this agreement between 1933 and 1939. The Palestinian Nakba of 1948 involved the violent displacement and dispossession of approximately 750,000 Palestinians, over 80% of the Arab population in the territory that became the State of Israel, through expulsion or flight, resulting in mass refugee creation. During this period, Zionist militias and later Israeli forces conducted dozens of massacres targeting Palestinian civilians, including the well-documented Deir Yassin massacre on April 9, 1948, where more than 100 Palestinians, including women, children, and elderly people, were killed by Irgun Izl and Lehi, LHI, units with Haganah support. Survivors reported systematic executions, including families being shot against walls, children having their heads smashed with sticks, and individuals being blown up with dynamite. Over 400 to 500 Palestinian villages and 11 cities were depopulated or destroyed, often repopulated with Jewish residents and given Hebrew names, while looting of homes, farms, and cultural archives was widespread. Psychological warfare, including radio broadcasts and targeted violence, was used to instill fear and accelerate flight. Israeli historian research cited in sources suggests over 30 documented massacres occurred during the 1948 war, with some estimates indicating more than 100, including major incidents at Deir Yassin, Dawama, and Tantura. The Al-Dawama massacre occurred on October 29, 1948, during the 1948 Arab-Israeli War, when the Israeli Army's 89th Commando Battalion, composed of former Irgun and Stern gang members, captured the Palestinian Arab town of Al-Dawama, located a few kilometers west of Hebron, as part of Operation Yov. The village, which had a population of around 6,000, including many recently displaced refugees, was reportedly considered very friendly by Haganah intelligence and encountered little resistance. According to the village Mukhtar, Hassan Mahmoud Aidab, Israeli forces approached from 3 directions in a semicircular movement, opened fire without a surrender call, and killed civilians indiscriminately for over an hour. The Mukhtar reported finding 60 bodies in the mosque and 80 bodies in a nearby cave called Iraq el-Zog, with a total of 455 people missing, including 280 men. Estimates of the death toll vary significantly. Historian Benny Morris estimated hundreds were killed, while an IDF investigation concluded around 100 villagers were killed. Other sources cite figures between 80 and 100, 100 and 200, or as high as 300. The massacre involved extreme brutality, including the killing of children by breaking their heads with sticks, the forced labor of women and children, and the intentional blowing up of houses and a cave containing civilians, including old women and a mother with a newborn baby. A soldier reportedly boasted of rapping a woman before shooting her. The Israeli government's own minister, Aharon Zisling, later expressed deep moral distress, stating that Jews had behaved like Nazis. The massacre was reportedly a reprisal for the Kfar Etzion massacre in May 1948 and the 1929 Hebron massacre. The Israeli military's actions were also seen as a method of expulsion and destruction, with the principle that the fewer Arabs remained, the better. The United Nations requested to investigate the incident, and after 3 denials, UN observers were finally allowed to visit on November 8, 1948. They observed houses still smoking and emitting a peculiar smell, as if bones were burning, and were denied access to the mosque and other areas, which were allegedly claimed to be mined. The American consul in Jerusalem reported that the UN investigation indicated a massacre had occurred, though the exact number of victims could not be determined. The settlement of Amatzia was established on the ruins of the village in 1955. At Tantura on May 15, 1948, Israeli troops reportedly massacred around 200 Palestinians over several hours, executing men lined up against cemetery walls. The displacement and repression continued after 1948. The 1967 Six-Day War led to the Nakba, involving the expulsion of 280,000 to 325,000 Palestinians and the razing of additional villages. In 1982, during the Lebanese Civil War, between 460 and 3,500 Palestinian and Lebanese Shia civilians were killed in the Sabra and Shatila refugee camps by the Lebanese forces, a Christian militia, between 16 and 18 September 1982. The Israel Defense Forces, IDF, had surrounded the camps and facilitated the militia's entry, having ordered them to clear out PLO fighters from the area. While the massacre unfolded, the IDF received reports of atrocities but failed to intervene to stop the killings. Israeli troops blocked exits from the camps and, at the request of the Lebanese forces, illuminated the area with flares during the night. The United Nations General Assembly later condemned the massacre as an act of genocide, though this characterization was contested by some member states. Israel has occupied the Gaza Strip since capturing it from Egypt during the Six-Day War in June 1967. The occupation has profoundly impacted living circumstances for Palestinians, leading to systematic human rights violations, restrictions on movement, and economic decline. Israel's military rule disrupted daily life, affecting access to work, education, healthcare, family visits, and basic resources like water and electricity. The average water consumption for Israelis is at least 4 times higher than for Palestinians in the occupied Palestinian territories. And in Gaza, 96% of the water is contaminated and unfit for human consumption. Over the decades, Israel confiscated Palestinian land and resources, with settlements established in Gaza until 2005, when Israel unilaterally withdrew its military forces and dismantled settlements. However, Israel maintained control over Gaza's airspace, maritime space, most land crossings, and the population registry, leading the United Nations and international human rights organizations to consider Gaza still under Israeli military occupation. Since 2007, following Hamas's takeover, Israel has enforced a blockade restricting the movement of goods and people, a policy that had already begun in the early 1990s. This blockade, coupled with repeated military conflicts, has devastated Gaza's economy and infrastructure. Unemployment is among the highest in the world, with an overall rate of 46% and youth unemployment reaching 70%. The territory has become one of the most densely populated areas globally, often described as an open-air prison. The ongoing conflict since October 2023 has exacerbated the crisis, resulting in widespread destruction, mass displacement, a severe humanitarian emergency, and an imminent famine. A provisional ceasefire began in January 2025, but ended after 2 months. Aerial imagery from 2025 shows vast areas of rubble and sprawling tent encampments, illustrating the scale of displacement and destruction. These conditions have led scholars and human rights organizations to describe Israel's actions as constituting genocide against the Palestinian people. In 2018, a series of peaceful protests known as the Great March of Return took place near the Gaza-Israel border, beginning on March 30, which is commemorated as Land Day. The demonstrations were organized by Palestinian civil society groups to protest the blockade of Gaza and to demand the right of return for Palestinian refugees. Around 30,000 unarmed Palestinians, including families, participated in the protests, which were intended to be nonviolent. Israeli security forces responded with live ammunition, including from army snipers, resulting in numerous casualties. On March 30 alone, more than 15 Palestinians were killed and over 1,000 injured, with some fatalities caused by live fire. By April 13, nearly 40 Palestinians had been killed and 3,000 injured during the protests, including 3 children. Graphic footage showed Israeli snipers shooting at demonstrators, including those fleeing, contradicting Israeli claims of self-defense. The Israeli government, including Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and Defense Minister Avigdor Lieberman, justified the use of force by labeling protesters as terrorists and claiming Hamas was orchestrating the events. Lieberman stated there were no innocent people in the Gaza Strip, and Likud party official Eli Hazen claimed all 30,000 protesters were legitimate targets. International figures and organizations condemned the violence. The UN Security Council held an emergency meeting, with members calling for an independent investigation into the killings. UN Assistant Secretary-General Teyebruk Zerihoun emphasized that lethal force should only be used as a last resort and urged maximum restraint. The UN reported that most demonstrators had stayed away from the fence and did not engage in violence, though some threw stones and there were isolated reports of armed militants attempting to breach the border. Among the casualties were medical personnel and journalists, including photojournalist Yasser Murtaja, who was shot while wearing a press vest and later died. The incident drew criticism from international figures like Jeremy Corbyn and Jan Egeland, who condemned Israel's actions and the lack of accountability. The protests continued through May 2018, with over 110 Palestinians killed by May 16, including 12 children, 2 journalists, and a paramedic, and more than 12,700 injured. The violence culminated on May 14, coinciding with the U.S. Embassy move to Jerusalem, when Israeli forces killed dozens of demonstrators, an event described by some as a massacre. Israel has occupied the Palestinian territories, comprising the West Bank, including East Jerusalem and the Gaza Strip, since June 1967, following the Six-Day War. This occupation has lasted for over 58 years as of 2025, making it the longest military occupation in modern history. The attack committed by Hamas on October 7, 2023, was known by the IDF and the Israeli intelligence agency 1 year in advance, as they had witnessed Hamas rehearsing the attack on multiple occasions. The $1 billion iron wall that divides Israel from Gaza was made inactive on that day, allowing Hamas to cross the borders into Israel, while it took several hours before the IDF chose to respond to the hostility they already knew was going to happen and was happening in Israel. The following war has allowed Israel to intensify the nature of its despotic occupation on Gaza. Following the Hamas attack on October 7, 2023, Israeli authorities and security forces have been found to have committed war crimes and crimes against humanity during their military campaign in the Gaza Strip. A United Nations Independent International Commission of Inquiry, COI, concluded that Israel's military operations involved violations of international humanitarian and human rights law, including the intentional use of heavy weapons with large destructive capacity in densely populated areas, which constituted an intentional and direct attack on the civilian population. The COI determined that the immense civilian casualties and widespread destruction of civilian infrastructure were the inevitable results of Israel's chosen strategy for the use of force, carried out with intent to cause maximum damage while disregarding principles of distinction, proportionality, and precaution. The Commission found that Israeli forces committed war crimes such as willful killing, intentional attacks against civilians, torture, inhuman or cruel treatment, and outrages upon personal dignity. It also identified patterns of conduct amounting to crimes against humanity, defined as a widespread and systematic attack directed at a civilian population. Specific actions cited include the starvation of Gaza's civilians through the blockade of essential supplies, which amounts to collective punishment, a war crime. The COI further criticized the Israeli military's application of the so-called Hannibal Directive, under which at least 14 Israeli civilians were killed in attempts to prevent the capture of soldiers. Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch have also documented serious violations, calling for investigations into Israeli attacks that killed scores of displaced civilians, particularly in Rafah, which should be investigated as war crimes. The UN Human Rights Council has identified clear evidence of war crimes by the Israel Defense Forces since October 7. The International Criminal Court's chief prosecutor stated that the situation in Gaza warrants investigation, emphasizing accountability for all parties. The Popular Forces, an Israeli-backed armed group active in the Gaza Strip, is currently funded and supported by Israel. Led by Yasser Abu Shabab, the group emerged in May 2024 during the Rafah offensive and operates in eastern Rafah and parts of Khan Yunis. Israeli officials have acknowledged providing weapons to the Popular Forces. In June 2025, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu confirmed that Israel was arming this group, despite allegations of its ties to the Islamic State, previously known as the terrorist group called ISIS. Consists of approximately 300 fighters, many of whom are former criminals or members of Salafi jihadist factions opposed to Hamas. The group exerts control over key aid routes near the Egypt-Gaza border and has been accused of looting humanitarian aid, with UN officials describing the activity as tactical, systematic criminal looting. While the group claims to protect civilians from Hamas, it has also been implicated in violence against Gazans seeking aid. The group's collaboration with Israel has drawn criticism from both Hamas and Israeli opposition figures, who have raised concerns about supporting a militia with alleged extremist links. This eternal realm of perpetual terror has been the reality for Palestinians young and old for decades. They have been robbed of a bright and happy future, filled with freedoms that many of us take for granted on a daily basis.